The mahogany conference table at Oberkommando des Heeres headquarters in Zossen gleamed under crystal chandeliers as senior artillery officers gathered for their monthly intelligence briefing. It was October 1943, and General Major Klaus von Reinhardt couldn't suppress a thin smile as he examined the intercepted American field manual spread before him. Around him, decorated veterans of the Eastern and Western fronts leaned forward, their expressions shifting from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. "Gentlemen," von Reinhardt began, tapping the document with his leather-gloved finger, "American intelligence believes they have revolutionized artillery warfare." He paused for effect, letting the absurdity sink in. "They call it time-on-target fire coordination." Oberst Frederick Wolf, whose artillery batteries had pulverized Polish fortifications in 1939, actually laughed out loud. "Time on target? What does that even mean? Are they suggesting we don't know when our shells arrive?" The concept, as described in the captured manual, seemed almost childishly simple to these battle-hardened professionals. The Americans proposed to have multiple artillery batteries positioned at various distances from a target fire their guns at precisely calculated intervals so that all shells would arrive at the exact same moment, not within a few seconds of each other as in traditional massed fire, but simultaneously within a fraction of a second. Von Reinhardt read aloud from the document. "By concentrating the fire of numerous batteries to impact at an identical moment, the enemy is given no warning, no opportunity to seek cover, and no chance to respond before complete devastation occurs." The room erupted in scoffs and dismissive gestures. These were men who had perfected the art of artillery warfare through generations of Prussian military tradition. Their batteries had demolished the Maginot Line. Their 88mm guns had become legendary on every front, and their coordination had been refined through years of actual combat. The notion that the Americans, who had only seriously entered the European War 18 months prior, could teach them anything about artillery coordination seemed preposterous. "Have they forgotten that we invented modern artillery doctrine?" Wolf demanded. "Our rolling barrages in the Great War were studied by every military academy in the world. Our counter-battery fire on the Eastern Front has destroyed thousands of Soviet guns. And now these Americans, with their jazz music and cowboy movies, think they can lecture us on artillery coordination?" Hauptmann Georg Steiner, a young but experienced forward observer who had survived the hell of Stalingrad, raised a practical objection. "Sir, the mathematics alone make this impossible. Every battery would be at a different range from the target. The flight times would vary by seconds, even tens of seconds. How could they possibly synchronize hundreds of shells from dozens of guns across kilometers of front?" Von Reinhardt nodded approvingly. "Precisely, Hauptmann. The Americans have always been better at engineering than warfare. They can mass-produce trucks and aircraft, but coordinating artillery requires centuries of military tradition, not factory efficiency. This is wishful thinking from a nation whose army was smaller than Romania's just 3 years ago." What none of these experienced officers understood, what they couldn't possibly have imagined as they dismissed the American innovation, was that they were examining the blueprint for their own obsolescence. They were looking at a revolution in warfare as significant as the machine gun or the tank, and they saw only the amateur fantasies of an upstart military power. The meeting moved on to what they considered more pressing matters: ammunition shortages on the Eastern Front, the increasing effectiveness of Soviet artillery, and the deployment of the remaining heavy batteries to defend against the expected Allied invasion of France. The American manual was filed away, briefly mentioned in an intelligence summary, and largely forgotten. None of them could have predicted that within 8 months, this impossible American technique would systematically destroy some of the finest artillery formations in the Wehrmacht. They couldn't foresee entire battery positions being obliterated before a single German gun could return fire, or their forward observers being killed before they could even identify where the devastating fire was coming from. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In their elegant headquarters, surrounded by maps marking their victories and defeats, these professional artillerymen made one of the war's most fatal miscalculations. They assumed that because something seemed difficult, it was impossible. They assumed that because they had centuries of tradition, there was nothing new to learn. Most critically, they assumed that the Americans would fight the way Europeans had always fought, bound by the same limitations, constrained by the same assumptions. But the Americans weren't constrained by tradition. They were constrained by something far more demanding, the need to win quickly, decisively, and with minimum casualties. And those constraints, as the Germans would soon discover, breed innovations that tradition never imagines. To understand the revolution that was coming, one must understand the fundamental difference in how the two nations approached the ancient art of artillery warfare. The contrast was as much philosophical as technical, reflecting deeper cultural values about precision, efficiency, and the very nature of warfare itself. The German artillery tradition was magnificent in its sophistication. Their gunners underwent years of intensive training, learning to calculate firing solutions with slide rules and logarithmic tables. A typical German artillery officer could determine range, elevation, and deflection by mental calculation, adjusting for wind, temperature, barometric pressure, and even the rotation of the Earth. Their fire direction centers were marvels of coordinated activity, with officers calling out calculations while NCOs plotted positions on detailed maps. Each German battery operated as a semi-independent unit, commanded by an officer who took personal pride in the accuracy and effectiveness of his guns. The batteries were positioned with careful attention to traditional military principles: concealment, fields of fire, and routes of withdrawal. Communication between batteries went through formal channels, with fire missions coordinated at division or corps level according to strict protocols established over decades of military refinement. This system produced remarkable results. German artillery had demonstrated devastating effectiveness in every theater of the war. Their counter-battery fire was particularly feared. Experienced German observers could locate enemy guns by sound and flash, calculate their position with uncanny accuracy, and bring precise fire to bear within minutes. Their 88mm guns had become legendary, serving equally well in anti-aircraft, anti-tank, and field artillery roles. Their 150mm howitzers could deliver shells with such precision that forward observers spoke of dropping them into a bucket. The German approach emphasized quality over quantity, precision over volume, and the skill of individual gun crews over systematic coordination. A master gunner was respected like a craftsman, someone who understood his weapon as an extension of his own body. The relationship between a gun crew and their piece was almost spiritual. Each gun had its quirks, its tendencies, its personality. Experienced crews could compensate for a worn barrel, adjust for a slightly bent trail, or recognize when their weapon was performing below standard. German artillery doctrine called for careful observation, precise calculation, and methodical fire. A typical fire mission might begin with ranging shots, followed by adjustments, then fire for effect once the target was precisely located. The process could take several minutes, but the result was efficient use of ammunition and maximum likelihood of destroying the target. This was artillery as a science, refined over centuries of European warfare. The American approach couldn't have been more different. American artillery officers in 1943 were largely civilian men who had been wearing uniforms for less than 2 years. Many had been teachers, engineers, accountants, or salesmen before the war. They brought with them not centuries of military tradition, but something potentially more valuable: fresh eyes and practical problem-solving skills honed in civilian life. Where Germans calculated with slide rules and tables, Americans increasingly relied on new tools: mechanical calculators, standardized firing charts, and simplified procedures that reduced complex mathematics to a series of straightforward steps. The goal wasn't to produce master craftsmen who understood every nuance of ballistics. It was to create a system so robust that adequately trained men could achieve devastating results. American artillery doctrine emphasized speed over precision, volume over accuracy, and systematic coordination over individual excellence. The philosophy was simple but radical. If you could get 10 batteries to fire at a target simultaneously, even if each battery was only 80% as accurate as a German gun, the cumulative effect would be far more devastating than sequential fire from more precise weapons. This reflected a fundamental difference in American thinking. In a nation built on mass production and systematic efficiency, the Americans approached artillery the way Ford approached automobiles. Standardize everything, simplify the process, enable rapid production and deployment. Where a German officer took pride in the unique capabilities of his battery, American officers took pride in how interchangeable their batteries were. Communication systems reflected this difference. While German artillery relied on traditional military communications, telephone lines when static, radio when mobile, and runners when necessary, Americans invested heavily in redundant, robust communication networks. Multiple radio frequencies, backup telephone lines, and even dedicated messenger systems ensured that batteries could coordinate even under the most chaotic battlefield conditions. The American Forward Observer System was particularly innovative. Rather than highly trained specialists who spent years learning their craft, the Americans created a system where relatively junior officers could call for devastating fire support. They carried simplified charts, used standardized procedures, and could request fire missions using clear, simple codes. The system assumed that individual observers might be killed, radios might fail, and chaos would reign, so it built in redundancy at every level. Most revolutionary was the American concept of massed fire. German doctrine generally called for assigning specific batteries to specific targets, with higher headquarters coordinating overall fire plans. American doctrine increasingly called for the ability to mass fires from any available battery onto any target anywhere within range at any time. This required a fundamental reimagining of artillery organization. American batteries weren't semi-independent units that happened to coordinate occasionally. They were components of a larger system designed from the ground up to operate as an integrated network. Fire direction centers calculated not just for their own batteries, but for any battery that might contribute to a mission. Communication systems were designed to link batteries across vast distances. Ammunition supply was standardized so that any battery could support any mission. The contrast extended to how the two sides viewed time itself. German artillery doctrine accepted that effective fire took time to observe, time to calculate, time to range, time to adjust. This wasn't seen as a weakness, but as necessary professionalism. Quick, unaimed fire was wasteful and ineffective. American doctrine increasingly viewed time as the ultimate weapon. The faster you could bring accurate fire to bear, the less time the enemy had to react, take cover, or respond. Speed wasn't just about efficiency, it was about denying the enemy the ability to fight back. This obsession with speed drove every aspect of their developing artillery system. Neither side fully understood the other's philosophy. Germans viewed American artillery as crude and wasteful, throwing shells at targets with more enthusiasm than precision. Americans viewed German artillery as unnecessarily complicated, using craftsman techniques when industrial methods would be more effective.
Both sides were partially right and dangerously wrong. The Germans were correct that their methods were more precise per gun, but they failed to understand that precision matters less when you can deliver overwhelming volume. The Americans were correct that speed and mass were devastating, but they initially underestimated the importance of accuracy and flexibility. The philosophical divide was about to be bridged by mathematics, innovation, and the desperate necessities of war. And in that bridging, one side would discover that their centuries of tradition had blinded them to possibilities that seemed obvious once someone actually tried them. The story of time-on-target artillery begins not with a dramatic eureka moment, but with a quiet crisis in a sun-baked training facility in the American Southwest. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the summer of 1941, was a sprawling complex of firing ranges, classrooms, and hastily constructed barracks, where the U.S. Army was desperately trying to create an artillery force capable of fighting a modern war. The scale of the challenge was staggering. In 1939, the entire U.S. Army numbered fewer than 200,000 men, with artillery batteries using equipment that wouldn't have seemed out of place in the First World War. Now, with war raging in Europe and tensions rising with Japan, the Army needed to expand to millions of men with modern artillery capabilities to match or exceed the battle-tested forces of Germany and Japan. The man who would change artillery warfare forever was hardly an obvious revolutionary. Lieutenant Colonel William Herbert Sands was a career artillery officer who had spent most of his pre-war service in administrative positions. 42 years old in 1941, Sands had never seen combat, never commanded a battery in action, and was considered by many of his contemporaries to be more of a staff officer than a field commander. What Sands possessed, however, was something more valuable than combat experience: a mathematics mind combined with an engineer's obsession with efficiency. Before the war, he had taught mathematics at West Point and had written several papers on ballistics that were noted more for their theoretical rigor than their practical application. His colleagues respected his intellect, but questioned whether his academic approach had any relevance to the chaos of actual warfare. The problem that obsessed Sands became apparent during routine training exercises at Fort Sill. The standard American artillery fire mission in 1941 followed a predictable pattern. Forward observers would identify a target, call for fire, and individual batteries would engage sequentially or near simultaneously. Even when multiple batteries fired at the same target, their shells arrived across a span of time, sometimes 5, 10, or even 20 seconds between the first impact and the last. To most officers, this seemed perfectly acceptable. Artillery fire was about sustained bombardment, wearing down enemy positions through accumulated damage. The idea that shells should arrive simultaneously seemed neither necessary nor particularly achievable. But Sands saw it differently. He had studied German artillery tactics in reports from Europe and recognized a critical vulnerability in traditional methods: the warning period. The moment the first shells began landing, enemy troops dove for cover, enemy artillery began counter-battery fire, and enemy commanders started relocating assets. Every second between the first shell and the last was a second for the enemy to respond. What if, Sands wondered, you could eliminate that warning period entirely? What if 50 or 100 shells could arrive at precisely the same instant, giving the enemy no time to react whatsoever? The idea seemed simple, almost obvious once stated, but the practical challenges were enormous. Each battery was positioned at a different distance from any given target. A battery 1 kilometer from the target would have shells that took perhaps 15 seconds to arrive. A battery 3 kilometers away might require 35 seconds. A battery at 6 kilometers might need 55 seconds. To make all these shells arrive simultaneously, each battery would need to fire at precisely the right moment, the distant batteries first, the closer batteries last, with timing calculated to the second. This required knowing the exact distance from each battery to the target, the exact flight time for each distance, and the ability to communicate firing orders to multiple batteries with split-second precision. In an era when artillery calculations were done by hand, when communication meant telephone lines or radio sets that frequently failed, and when coordinating even 2 batteries required extensive planning, the idea seemed fantastical. Several of Sands's colleagues told him directly that he was wasting his time on an impossibility. But Sands had one advantage. He wasn't trying to perfect existing methods. He was trying to create something entirely new. He could design his system from the ground up without being constrained by the way things had always been done. He began with the mathematics. Working late into the night in his quarters, Sands developed firing tables that showed the flight time for shells at various ranges, elevations, and propellant charges. These tables weren't revolutionary. Similar tables had existed for decades. What was revolutionary was how Sands organized them for rapid use. Instead of requiring complex calculations for each firing mission, Sands created simplified charts where an officer could find the necessary information in seconds. Given a target location and battery position, the charts showed instantly when that battery needed to fire to achieve a specific impact time. The next challenge was communication. Traditional fire missions involved extensive back and forth between forward observers, fire direction centers, and individual batteries. Orders were given sequentially, with each battery receiving its firing instructions one at a time. This process might take several minutes for a single battery, and scaling it to multiple batteries multiplied the time required. Sands proposed a radical solution: a fire direction center that could calculate firing data for all batteries simultaneously and transmit orders to all of them in a single coordinated message. Instead of Battery A fire mission, followed by Battery B fire mission, the order would be all batteries, time on target mission, fire on my mark. This required developing new communication protocols, new message formats, and new procedures for fire direction centers. It required training radio operators to handle multiple simultaneous transmissions. It required battery commanders to execute orders with the precision that traditional artillery had never demanded. The first test, conducted in August 1941 at Fort Sill, was a disaster. Sands had coordinated 4 batteries for a simultaneous impact on a target area marked with white panels. The batteries fired at their calculated times. The shells did not arrive simultaneously. They were spread across nearly 15 seconds, barely better than a traditional fire mission. Post-mission analysis revealed the problems: timing errors in communication, inconsistent propellant charges causing variations in flight time, differences in how individual batteries interpreted firing orders, and simple human error in executing the precise timing required. Most officers would have abandoned the experiment. The practical difficulties seemed to confirm that the idea, while theoretically sound, was impossible to execute with real soldiers, real equipment, and real battlefield conditions. Sands saw it differently. He saw a system that needed refinement, not abandonment. He began a systematic process of identifying and eliminating each source of error. Propellant charges were standardized and temperature controlled. Communication protocols were refined to eliminate ambiguity. Battery procedures were drilled until they became instinctive. Timing devices were improved and synchronized. The second test, in October 1941, was better. 4 batteries firing at a target 3 kilometers away achieved impacts within a 3-second window. Still not simultaneous, but progress. The third test achieved a 2-second window. The fourth test, involving 6 batteries, returned to a 5-second spread. The system didn't scale well initially. Sands kept refining. He recruited a team of officers who shared his vision, including Major Thomas Farnsworth, a former high school mathematics teacher who brought practical teaching skills to the problem of training artillerymen in the new techniques. Together, they developed training programs, refined procedures, and continued testing. By December 1941, when Pearl Harbor brought America fully into the war, Sands had achieved something remarkable. He could reliably coordinate 4 to 6 batteries to impact within a 1-second window. It still wasn't perfect simultaneity, but it was close enough to be devastating. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed Sands' experimental project from an academic curiosity into a potential war-winning weapon. Suddenly, the Army was desperate for any advantage, any innovation that might help American forces compete with battle-hardened German and Japanese armies. Sands found himself summoned to Washington to brief senior officers on his methods. The briefing, held in a Pentagon conference room in January 1942,
was Sand's moment to convince the Army's leadership that his impossible idea was not only possible, but necessary. He faced a skeptical audience of generals who had their own ideas about artillery and limited patience for untested theories. Sands presented his case methodically. He showed the mathematics, demonstrated with charts and diagrams how the system worked, and presented data from his tests. But what convinced the generals wasn't the theory, it was the filmed demonstration of his most recent test. The film showed 6 batteries positioned at varying distances from a target area. At the command to fire, the batteries engaged in sequence, distant batteries first, nearer batteries last. The camera focused on the target area. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, in a single instant, the entire target area erupted in a single instantaneous series of explosions. 18 shells arriving in a fraction of a second. The contrast with traditional artillery was stark. In a normal fire mission, observers would see impacts spread across time, giving a sense of where the fire was concentrated and allowing defensive responses. In this demonstration, there was no warning, no gradual building of fire, just instantaneous devastation across the entire target area. General Leslie McNair, who commanded Army ground forces and was responsible for training and doctrine, understood the implications immediately. "Colonel Sands," he said quietly, "if this works in combat as well as it works on a firing range, it will revolutionize artillery warfare." McNair authorized expanded testing and, critically, the development of training programs to spread the technique across the entire artillery force. Sands was promoted to full colonel and given authority to establish a specialized school at Fort Sill dedicated to teaching time-on-target methods. But authorization was one thing, implementation was another. The U.S. Army was expanding at an unprecedented rate. Artillery units were being formed, trained, and shipped overseas in a matter of months. Instilling a revolutionary new technique in this environment seemed nearly impossible. Sands and his team faced enormous challenges. Many experienced artillery officers resisted the new methods, seeing them as unnecessary complications to proven techniques. Training time was limited. Units couldn't spend months perfecting new procedures when they were needed overseas immediately. Equipment was inconsistent. Different units had different radios, different fire control equipment, different capabilities. But Sands had one critical advantage. He wasn't asking artillerymen to be better. He was giving them a system that made them more effective with the skills they already had. The genius of time on target was not that it required superhuman precision from individual gunners. It was that it coordinated adequate precision from multiple batteries to create overwhelming effect. The training program emphasized simplicity and standardization. Fire direction procedures were broken down into step-by-step processes that could be learned quickly. Communication protocols used simple, clear language that minimized errors. Firing tables and charts were designed for rapid use under stress. By mid-1942, the first artillery battalions trained in time-on-target methods were deploying to combat theaters. They carried with them not just new procedures, but a new philosophy of artillery warfare, one that emphasized coordination over individual precision, speed over sustained bombardment, and systematic, overwhelming force over traditional fire missions. The Germans, monitoring American training activities through intelligence reports and intercepted communications, noted the new American interest in coordinated artillery fire. But their analysis concluded that the Americans were simply copying German massed fire techniques, perhaps with typical American emphasis on quantity over quality. What the Germans didn't understand, what they couldn't understand without seeing it in action, was that the Americans weren't copying anything. They were creating something entirely new, something that would make traditional artillery warfare obsolete. The stage was set for a revolution. The theory was sound, the methods were developed, and the training was underway.
all that remained was the ultimate test: combat against the finest artillery force in the world under conditions where failure meant not just theoretical defeat, but the lives of American soldiers. The first true test of time-on-target artillery in combat came not with dramatic fanfare, but with quiet desperation. In February 1943, American forces in North Africa were still reeling from their humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass, where German forces had mauled inexperienced American units and exposed critical weaknesses in American training, tactics, and leadership. Among the American units rushed to stabilize the situation was the 133rd Field Artillery Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell. The 133rd was one of the first battalions to complete the new time-on-target training at Fort Sill, though Mitchell himself had been skeptical of the methods when first introduced to them. "I didn't see the point," Mitchell would later admit in his after-action report. "We knew how to shoot artillery. We've been doing it for generations. This seemed like a complicated solution to a problem that didn't exist." Mitchell's skepticism reflected a common attitude among experienced artillery officers. The traditional American methods, while perhaps less refined than German techniques, had proven effective in the First World War and in training. Why fix what wasn't broken? The baptism by fire came on the morning of February 19, 1943, near the town of Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia. German forces had launched a major offensive, and American units were falling back under pressure from veteran German armor and artillery. Mitchell's battalion, positioned in support of the 1st Armored Division, received urgent orders to provide fire support to American units being overrun. The tactical situation was desperate. German artillery had already destroyed 2 American batteries that attempted to engage with traditional fire missions. The German counter-battery fire was devastatingly effective. Their forward observers identified American gun positions within minutes, and their return fire was precise and deadly. Mitchell made a decision that would change his perspective forever. Rather than engaging the German positions with traditional sequential fire, he would attempt a full time-on-target mission, the first ever attempted in combat conditions against a major enemy force. The target was a German artillery battery that had been hammering American positions for the past hour. Intelligence reports suggested it consisted of 6 105mm howitzers positioned in an olive grove approximately 4 kilometers from Mitchell's forward positions. German observers had established positions on the surrounding hills, giving them excellent visibility to identify and engage any American batteries that revealed their positions. Mitchell coordinated with 2 other American artillery battalions in the area, the 17th and 91st Field Artillery. Together, they had 18 105mm howitzers that could range the German position. Under traditional doctrine, coordinating fire from 3 separate battalions would require extensive communication, probably alerting German observers to the impending attack and resulting in sequential impacts that would give German gunners time to displace or take cover. The time-on-target method offered a different approach. Mitchell's Fire Direction Center calculated the precise firing time for each of the 18 guns based on their distance from the target. The distant guns would fire first, the nearer guns last, with the timing calibrated so all shells would arrive simultaneously. The communication was simple and brief. Time-on-target mission, target coordinates, classified. Impact time, 0847 hours. Battery A fires at 0846:15. Battery B fires at 0846:28. Battery C fires at 0846:35. Each battery received only its specific firing time and the target coordinates. The brevity of the communication was intentional. German radio intercept units couldn't gain intelligence from scattered, brief transmissions to multiple batteries. Traditional fire missions involved extensive back-and-forth communication that telegraphed American intentions. This was different. By the time German observers realized what was happening, it would already be over. At precisely 0846 hours and 15 seconds, the first American battery fired. 15 seconds later, another, then another. The firing pattern seemed random to German observers, American guns firing from scattered positions without apparent coordination. For the German artillery battery in the olive grove, there was no warning. Their observers saw nothing unusual.
Their sound-ranging equipment detected some American firing, but nothing suggesting an imminent threat to their specific position. The German gunners were in the middle of preparing their next fire mission, with crews loading shells and adjusting gun laying. At precisely 08:47 hours, 18 105mm shells arrived simultaneously in an area roughly 50 meters in diameter. The effect was catastrophic. In traditional artillery fire, the first shells provide warning. Gunners drop their shells and dive for cover. Crews abandon their guns to seek protection. The bombardment continues, but much of its effect is wasted on empty gun positions. In a time-on-target mission, there is no warning. One instant the battery is operational. The next instant, it's engulfed in a coordinated storm of high-explosive shells. Every gun, every ammunition stockpile, every crew position is struck simultaneously before anyone can react.
When American reconnaissance aircraft overflew the position an hour later, they found complete devastation. All 6 German guns were destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. Ammunition stockpiles had detonated in sympathetic explosions. The battery's vehicles were burning. Casualty estimates suggested that fewer than a third of the German gunners survived, and most survivors were wounded. But the most significant effect wasn't the physical destruction. It was the complete absence of German counter-battery fire. Normally, any American battery that engaged would immediately receive return fire from German artillery. The Germans were masters of counter-battery warfare, with observers who could locate enemy guns by flash and sound, and experienced gun crews who could return accurate fire within minutes. This time, by the time German observers realized what had happened, the firing batteries were already displacing to new positions. The brief, scattered communication had given German radio intercept units no useful intelligence. The simultaneous impact had killed or wounded the German observers in the target area before they could identify the firing batteries. For the first time in the North African campaign, American artillery had engaged a German battery and destroyed it without receiving any return fire. The significance of this engagement spread rapidly through American artillery circles. Within days, other battalions were attempting similar missions. The results were consistently impressive. German batteries that had been tormenting American forces for weeks were being destroyed before they could respond. But the true test came 3 weeks later, in early March 1943, during the Battle of El Guetar. American forces were defending against a German armored attack when German artillery began a devastating bombardment of American positions. Forward observers identified multiple German battery positions, a concentration of artillery that represented a significant portion of German firepower in the sector. Brigadier General Raymond Burton, the division artillery commander, saw an opportunity. If time on target could destroy one battery, could it engage multiple batteries simultaneously? Could it deliver a counter-battery strike of unprecedented scale and devastation? The mission was extraordinarily complex. Burton coordinated fire from 5 American artillery battalions, a total of 60 105mm howitzers. The targets were 4 German battery positions spread across a front of approximately 2 kilometers. The mission called for each American battalion to engage a specific German battery, with all impacts occurring at precisely 14:30 hours. The coordination required was staggering. 5 fire direction centers, calculating firing times for 60 guns across varied terrain, with communication to all batteries, precise synchronization of timing, and all executed within a compressed time frame to maintain security. At 14:30 hours, American forward observers watching the German positions witnessed something no one had seen before in warfare. Across a 2-kilometer front, 4 separate German battery positions erupted simultaneously in perfectly coordinated explosions. 60 shells arriving within a 2-second window, effectively simultaneous for any practical purpose, delivered concentrated destruction across multiple targets at once. The destruction was even more complete than the first test. Of the 4 German batteries engaged, 3 were completely destroyed. The 4th was so heavily damaged that it required days to return to operation. Combined, the Germans lost approximately 24 guns and suffered over 200 casualties. The German response was telling. Their after-action reports reflected confusion and concern. How had the Americans achieved such devastating counter-battery fire? German observers reported that American guns fired from positions that should have been out of range, yet shells arrived with precision. German radio intercept units reported only brief, cryptic communications before the strike, nothing that should have indicated such a major fire mission. One German artillery officer, captured a week later, expressed bewilderment. "We heard some American guns firing, but nothing unusual. Then our entire battery was destroyed in an instant. We never knew where the fire came from or how they achieved such precision. It was like being struck by lightning from a clear sky." The psychological effect was as significant as the physical destruction. German artillery units, previously confident in their superiority, now faced an enemy whose capabilities they couldn't understand or counter. American forward observers reported that German batteries began changing positions more frequently, fired less often, and showed increased reluctance to engage American forces, all in response to an American capability that barely existed 6 months earlier. American artillery casualties dropped dramatically. In January 1943, American artillery units in North Africa suffered heavy losses to German counter-battery fire. By April 1943, after time-on-target methods became standard, American artillery losses decreased by over 70% despite increased engagement with German forces. Back at Fort Sill, the reports from North Africa were analyzed with intense interest. The tactical successes were impressive, but what excited the training staff was that the system worked even better in combat than in training. The chaos and stress of actual warfare hadn't degraded performance. If anything, the high stakes and clear purpose had improved execution. Colonel Sands, reviewing the after-action reports, noted one particularly significant detail. The battalions that achieved the best results weren't necessarily the most experienced. They were the ones that followed the standardized procedures most precisely. The system worked because it didn't require extraordinary individual skill. It required disciplined execution of clear procedures. This discovery had profound implications. It meant that newly formed artillery battalions could achieve devastating effectiveness within months of training, not years. It meant that American artillery could be expanded rapidly without sacrificing effectiveness. Most importantly, it meant that the United States had discovered a method to counter German artillery superiority through systematic coordination rather than traditional military excellence. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in North Africa, received briefings on the new artillery methods with growing appreciation. Here was a tangible American advantage, something that German forces couldn't easily copy or counter. Eisenhower issued orders for all American artillery units to adopt time-on-target methods and prioritize the deployment of specially trained artillery units to critical theaters.
But success in North Africa was just the beginning. The real test would come in Europe, where American forces would face the full weight of German military power, where German artillery operated with decades of refined doctrine and experienced crews, and where the stakes were nothing less than the liberation of Western Europe. The desperate experiment of a mathematics professor turned artillery officer was about to transform the battlefield of World War II. And the German generals who had laughed at American artillery innovations were about to discover that some revolutions arrive not with warning, but in a single, devastating instant. The success of time-on-target artillery in North Africa triggered a transformation in American artillery doctrine that rippled across every theater of war. What had begun as an experimental technique practiced by a handful of specially trained battalions became, within months, the standard operating procedure for the entire American artillery force. The scale and speed of this transformation reflected both the desperate urgency of war and the unique advantages of the American military system. In April 1943, the War Department issued Field Manual 6-40, Field Artillery Gunnery, which codified time-on-target procedures as standard doctrine. But a manual was just paper.
The real challenge was training tens of thousands of artillerymen in techniques that many experienced officers still viewed with skepticism. Fort Sill underwent a massive expansion to meet this challenge. The artillery school that had trained perhaps 1,000 officers per year before the war now processed over 15,000 annually. New firing ranges were carved out of the Oklahoma prairie. Barracks sprang up overnight to house the flood of trainees. The faculty expanded from a few dozen experienced instructors to hundreds, many of them recent combat veterans rushed back from North Africa and Sicily specifically to teach the new methods. Major Thomas Farnsworth, now promoted to lieutenant colonel and serving as chief of artillery instruction, faced the monumental task of systematizing what had been developed through trial and error. We had to take methods that Colonel Sands and his team had refined over 2 years and teach them to new lieutenants in 6 weeks, Farnsworth later wrote. It seemed impossible, but the alternative was sending our boys into combat with inferior artillery support. The training program Farnsworth developed became a model of systematic instruction. Rather than teaching the complex mathematics behind time-on-target calculations, instructors taught simplified procedures that could be executed reliably under stress. Firing charts were redesigned for rapid use. Communication protocols were drilled until they became instinctive. Most importantly, the training emphasized coordination between batteries, something that traditional artillery training had largely ignored. The innovation extended to equipment. The Signal Corps developed improved radio sets specifically for artillery coordination, with greater range and reliability than standard battlefield radios. The Ordnance Department standardized propellant charges to reduce variations in shell flight time. Even seemingly minor details like synchronized watches issued to all fire direction personnel contributed to the system's effectiveness. But the most significant factor in the rapid adoption of time-on-target methods was human. The young officers and NCOs who embraced the new techniques with enthusiasm precisely because they lacked the ingrained habits of traditional artillery warfare. These were men who were civilians months earlier, teachers, farmers, factory workers, shopkeepers, who brought fresh perspectives unencumbered by decades of military tradition. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a former high school mathematics teacher from Iowa, exemplified this new breed of artillery officer. Assigned to the 155th Field Artillery Battalion in June 1943, Hayes had never seen an artillery piece before entering the Army. Yet within 3 months of intensive training, he was coordinating time-on-target missions involving multiple battalions, with a proficiency that would have taken years to achieve under traditional training methods. The beauty of the system, Hayes later explained, was that you didn't need to be a genius. You just needed to follow the procedures carefully and trust that the mathematics worked. It was like teaching algebra to high school students. If you broke it down into clear steps and practiced enough, anyone could do it. This democratization of artillery expertise was revolutionary. Traditional artillery required years to develop master gunners who could calculate complex firing solutions mentally. Time on target required weeks to train competent operators who could execute standardized procedures. The American system traded individual brilliance for systematic effectiveness, and in doing so, created a capability that could be scaled to meet the demands of global war. By the summer of 1943, American artillery battalions deploying to combat theaters carried with them not just new procedures, but new confidence. They had trained extensively in time-on-target methods, practiced coordinating with other battalions, and understood that they possessed capabilities that enemy forces couldn't match. This psychological transformation was as important as the tactical one. The numbers told the story of this transformation. In January 1943, fewer than 10% of American artillery battalions had trained in time-on-target methods. By July 1943, over 60% had completed the training. By December 1943, it was universal. Every American artillery battalion in every theater had adopted the new doctrine. The logistical challenge of this transformation was staggering. Training materials had to be produced and distributed to units scattered across North Africa, the Pacific, Britain, and the United States. Instructors had to be trained and deployed. Equipment had to be standardized and supplied. Communication systems had to be upgraded. All of this occurred while simultaneously expanding the overall size of American artillery forces and maintaining combat operations in multiple theaters. The American industrial and organizational capacity that made this possible astonished observers from other nations. British artillery officers watching American units train in England for the invasion of France marveled at the systematic efficiency of the American approach. "They've turned artillery into a production line," one British colonel observed, half in admiration and half in disbelief.
The contrast with German artillery development was stark. While American artillery was undergoing revolutionary transformation, German artillery remained locked in its traditional excellence. German gunners were still among the finest in the world, individually skilled, professionally competent, tactically sophisticated. But their system couldn't adapt at the scale or speed the Americans achieved. German attempts to counter American time-on-target methods revealed the limitations of their approach. German artillery doctrine called for dispersing batteries to reduce vulnerability to counter battery fire. This worked against traditional artillery, which had to engage each battery sequentially. Against time on target, dispersion simply meant that American artillery could engage multiple German batteries simultaneously, destroying them all before any could respond. German innovations in counter-battery warfare, sound and flash ranging, aerial observation, signals intelligence proved less effective against time-on-target missions. The brief communications gave little intelligence. The simultaneous firing from multiple positions made location difficult. The speed of engagement gave German observers no time to identify American battery positions before the American guns displaced to new locations. Most critically, the German artillery system couldn't adopt similar methods because it lacked the organizational structure to do so. German batteries operated as semi-independent units under regimental control. Coordinating multiple batteries required navigating strict hierarchical chains of command. The German system was optimized for centralized planning and decentralized execution, exactly the opposite of what time on target required. American artillery, by contrast, was organized from the ground up for flexible coordination. Fire direction centers at battalion, division, and corps level could mass fires from any available battery onto any target within range. The system assumed that batteries would routinely coordinate with units they'd never trained with in situations that couldn't be planned in advance under conditions of chaos and uncertainty. This organizational flexibility reflected deeper differences in American and German military culture. The German military emphasized hierarchy, discipline, and adherence to established doctrine. The American military, reflecting its civilian roots, emphasized initiative, adaptability, and pragmatic problem-solving. Neither approach was inherently superior, but for the specific challenge of coordinating artillery fire, the American approach proved decisively more effective. By late 1943, American artillery had achieved something unprecedented in military history. A force of hundreds of thousands of men, equipped with thousands of guns, all trained and organized to execute a revolutionary tactical method that had barely existed 18 months earlier. The transformation from experimental technique to universal doctrine had occurred at a pace that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. The human cost of this achievement was real, but often overlooked. Training accidents claimed lives. Live fire exercises with artillery are inherently dangerous, and the intensive pace of training multiplied the risks. Officers and NCOs worked crushing schedules, training one group of soldiers while planning for the next, all while dealing with equipment shortages and organizational chaos.
The stress of transforming an entire branch of service while simultaneously fighting a global war took its toll in exhaustion, illness, and breakdowns. But those who lived through this period also remembered it with pride. They had been part of something larger than themselves, a genuine revolution in warfare, accomplished not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through systematic innovation and disciplined execution. They had taken an idea that experts said was impossible and made it standard practice. Lieutenant Colonel Sands, promoted to Brigadier General and appointed to oversee artillery training across all American forces, visited training facilities constantly during this period. He watched young officers master in weeks what had taken him years to develop, saw batteries coordinate with a precision he had once thought unattainable, and recognized that his experimental idea had become something far larger than he had imagined. "I thought I was developing a tactical technique," Sands later reflected. "What I actually created was a new philosophy of artillery warfare, one that emphasized coordination over individual excellence, speed over sustained fire, and systematic effectiveness over traditional mastery." The young officers and men who adopted these methods didn't just learn new procedures, they learned to think about artillery in fundamentally different ways. As 1943 turned to 1944 and American forces prepared for the invasion of France, American artillery stood ready to demonstrate the full potential of this new philosophy. The greatest test was coming, not against isolated German batteries in North Africa, but against the concentrated might of German artillery defending Fortress Europe. The Germans, reading intelligence reports about American artillery methods with growing concern, still didn't fully grasp what they were about to face. They understood that American artillery had improved. They recognized that American counter-battery fire had become more effective, but they continued to believe that their superior training, experience, and tactical sophistication would prevail in the crucial battles ahead. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, would provide the ultimate test of American artillery doctrine. Operation Overlord represented the largest amphibious assault in history, putting Allied forces ashore on heavily defended beaches against German forces that had spent years fortifying the French coast. Artillery support would be crucial, not just for the initial landing, but for the grinding battle through the hedgerows of Normandy that everyone knew would follow. The American artillery plan for Normandy reflected the lessons learned in North Africa and Italy. Rather than assigning batteries to specific infantry units in traditional fashion, American artillery was organized into flexible fire support groups that could mass fires rapidly on any target across the beachhead. The plan called for unprecedented coordination. Dozens of battalions prepared to deliver time-on-target missions within minutes of receiving fire requests.
The hedgerow country of Normandy, small fields separated by ancient earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, created perfect defensive terrain for German forces. German machine gun nests, mortar positions, and artillery observers could hide in the hedgerows, inflicting casualties on attacking American forces while remaining nearly invisible. Traditional American artillery struggled in this terrain. Forward observers couldn't see targets, and individual fire missions had limited effectiveness against well-concealed German positions. Time-on-target missions changed the equation. Even when American observers couldn't pinpoint exact German positions, they could identify likely concentration areas, crossroads where German forces would gather, defiles where German reserves would move, hedgerow junctions where German observation posts would be located. Time-on-target missions could saturate these areas with simultaneous fire, destroying German forces before they could disperse or take cover. The Battle of St. Lo in July 1944 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of this approach.
American forces attacking toward this crucial road junction faced fierce German resistance from elements of the 3rd Parachute Division and Panzer Lehr Division, elite German units that had stopped previous American attacks cold. The American artillery plan for the St. Lo offensive was audacious in its scale. 12 artillery battalions, 144 guns ranging from 105mm howitzers to 155mm long toms were coordinated to deliver time-on-target missions against identified German positions. The fire plan called for a rolling barrage of time-on-target missions. Rather than sustained bombardment of single areas, American artillery would strike multiple German positions simultaneously, then shift to new targets, then shift again, creating a pattern of devastating strikes that gave German forces no time to recover or reposition. On the morning of July 11th, the barrage began. At precisely 0600 hours, the first time-on-target mission struck German forward positions, 18 batteries firing 216 shells that arrived within a 2-second window. Before German observers could even report the strike, a second mission hit German artillery positions 3 kilometers behind the front line. 30 seconds later, a third mission struck German headquarters locations. The psychological effect on German forces was devastating. Survivors reported feeling helpless. There was no warning before strikes, no way to predict where fire would fall next, no opportunity to respond or seek better cover. Traditional artillery bombardments, however heavy, had a rhythm that experienced soldiers could adapt to. Time-on-target missions had no rhythm, just sudden, overwhelming violence that could strike anywhere at any moment. A German lieutenant, captured 2 days later, described the experience. "We knew the Americans had more artillery than us. We had faced their bombardments before. This was different. Our forward positions, our artillery batteries, our headquarters, all struck simultaneously as if by a giant fist. Our radios went dead, our observers were killed, our guns were destroyed before they could fire a single shell in response. In 30 minutes of American artillery fire, our battalion ceased to exist as a fighting unit." The effectiveness of time-on-target missions in Normandy went beyond simple destruction of German forces. The speed and precision of American artillery fire allowed American infantry to advance under much closer artillery support than traditional methods permitted. In traditional artillery warfare, there had to be a significant pause between when artillery lifted and when infantry advanced. Otherwise, American troops risked being struck by their own shells falling short. Time-on-target missions minimized this danger. Because all shells arrived simultaneously, rather than over an extended period of time, the actual duration of fire on any target was measured in seconds, not minutes. Artillery could strike German positions, and within 30 seconds, American infantry could be advancing through the impact area. This time compression gave German defenders no opportunity to recover from artillery strikes before American infantry was upon them. Major Robert Caldwell, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 23rd Infantry Regiment, described the tactical revolution this created. Before Normandy, calling for artillery meant asking infantry to stop, take cover, wait for the fire mission, wait for the shelling to end, then advance. It broke our momentum. With time on target, we barely slowed down. My radio man would call the fire mission, we'd pause for maybe 90 seconds, there'd be a massive explosion ahead of us, and we'd advance immediately through the smoke. We were fighting at a tempo the Germans couldn't match. The Germans struggled to adapt. Their artillery doctrine called for careful observation, precise calculation, and methodical fire, exactly what time-on-target missions denied them the opportunity to execute. German batteries that attempted to engage American forces found themselves targeted by devastating counter-battery fire before they could complete even a single fire mission. German forward observers trying to identify American artillery positions found that by the time they located a battery and called for fire, the American battery had already displaced to a new position. German after-action reports from Normandy reflect growing desperation. One artillery commander reported, "American artillery superiority is not merely numerical. Their coordination exceeds anything in our doctrine or experience. They mass fires from dozens of batteries onto single targets with a speed and precision that seems impossible. Our counter-battery fire, once our greatest strength, has become nearly ineffective. By the time we locate and engage American batteries, they have displaced and are firing from new positions." The statistics told the story. In the first month of the Normandy campaign, American artillery fired approximately 500,000 rounds of ammunition. German artillery, with roughly equivalent numbers of guns initially, fired less than 200,000 rounds, not because they lacked ammunition, but because aggressive American counter-battery fire using time-on-target methods destroyed German guns faster than they could be replaced or repaired. American artillery casualties in Normandy were dramatically lower than in previous campaigns. Despite heavy fighting and aggressive German efforts at counter-battery fire, American artillery units suffered roughly 30% of the casualties they had experienced in comparable Italian campaigns. The speed of time-on-target missions, fire and displace before the enemy could respond, provided protection that no amount of camouflage or fortification could match.
But perhaps the most telling validation came from German prisoners. Interrogators noted that German soldiers expressed genuine fear of American artillery, not just respect for its volume, but actual terror at its unpredictability and devastating effectiveness. German veterans who had survived the Eastern Front, where Soviet artillery bombardments sometimes lasted for hours, said they feared American time-on-target missions more than the sustained Soviet barrages. Soviet artillery would bomb an area for hours, one German sergeant explained. It was terrifying, but you learned to survive, dig deep enough, wait it out, emerge when the shelling stopped. American artillery would strike without warning and be gone in seconds. But those seconds were more devastating than hours of Soviet fire, and you never knew when or where the next strike would come. It made us afraid to concentrate our forces, afraid to hold positions too long, afraid to even gather for meals. The Americans made us afraid of our own artillery tactics. The success in Normandy spread throughout the American artillery force. Techniques that had worked in France were immediately adopted in Italy, where American artillery supported the grinding advance up the Italian peninsula. They were transmitted to the Pacific, where time-on-target missions proved equally effective against Japanese forces. Within months, time-on-target had become not just standard American practice, but the foundation of American artillery dominance in every theater. Individual stories of remarkable time-on-target missions became legendary within American artillery circles. There was the mission in August 1944, where a single forward observer, surrounded by German forces, called down a time-on-target mission from 7 battalions on his own position, wiping out the German unit while he sheltered in a stone building that somehow survived. There was the counter-battery mission that destroyed 12 German artillery pieces in a single strike, capturing the attention of General Omar Bradley himself. There was the fire mission that broke up a German armored counterattack, destroying tanks and infantry with such precision that American forces advanced through the impact area just minutes later. These stories, passed from unit to unit, reinforced the culture of aggressive, confident artillery employment that characterized American forces. American forward observers called for fire with a freedom that would have seemed reckless by pre-war standards. American battery commanders displaced their guns constantly, never staying in one position long enough for German counter-battery fire to find them. American fire direction centers coordinated missions of stunning complexity with routine efficiency. The human dimension of this transformation was profound. Young officers like Lieutenant Hayes, who had been civilians less than 2 years earlier, were coordinating fire missions that destroyed veteran German formations. NCOs who had learned artillery from scratch were outperforming German gunners with decades of experience. The American system had indeed democratized artillery expertise, not by making every soldier a master craftsman, but by creating systematic methods that enabled adequate soldiers to achieve extraordinary results through coordination and speed. By the fall of 1944, as American forces advanced across France towards Germany itself, American artillery had established an undeniable superiority that German forces could neither counter nor match. The weapon that German generals had dismissed as impossible had become the dominant artillery force in the European theater, and the full demonstration of its devastating potential was still to come. As Allied forces approached the German border in September 1944, German military leadership faced an artillery crisis that threatened to cripple their defensive capabilities. The systematic destruction of German artillery throughout the summer had reduced their available firepower to levels not seen since the early days of the war. More troubling than the numbers was the psychological impact. German artillerymen, once confident in their technical superiority, now operated with constant fear of American counter-battery fire. The German response to American time-on-target methods revealed the fatal rigidity of their military system. German artillery doctrine, refined over generations and codified in detailed manuals, had no answer to an enemy that operated outside traditional parameters. Every German tactical principle, careful observation, methodical calculation, sustained fire, was rendered obsolete by an enemy that struck without warning and vanished before counterfire could arrive. German artillery commanders attempted various solutions, all unsuccessful. They tried dispersing their batteries more widely, but time-on-target missions simply engaged multiple dispersed batteries simultaneously. They tried frequent displacement, but American forward observers and aerial reconnaissance located them as fast as they moved. They tried reducing their rate of fire to minimize detection, but this only decreased their tactical effectiveness, while American artillery continued operating aggressively. Most tellingly, German attempts to adopt similar coordinated fire methods failed completely. The German artillery system, with its hierarchical command structure and emphasis on battery independence, couldn't execute the flexible coordination that time on target required. German batteries, trained to operate under regimental control, couldn't easily coordinate with batteries from other regiments. German communication systems, optimized for traditional fire missions, struggled with the precise timing that simultaneous impacts demanded. A captured German artillery manual from late 1944, annotated by an American intelligence officer, reveals the extent of German confusion. The manual contains handwritten notes attempting to describe American time-on-target methods, but the descriptions are riddled with errors and misunderstandings. The German annotator clearly grasped that American artillery was doing something fundamentally different, but couldn't comprehend how the system actually worked. One note reads, "The Americans have abandoned proper artillery procedure. They fire without proper observation, without adjustment, without sustained bombardment. Yet their fire is devastatingly effective. This seems impossible, but the evidence is undeniable." The growing gap between American and German artillery capabilities became starkly apparent during the Battle of the Hirten Forest in October and November 1944. This brutal engagement, fought in dense forest terrain that negated many American advantages, should have favored German defensive tactics. The forest canopy limited aerial observation, the rugged terrain restricted mobility, and German forces held prepared defensive positions. Yet even in this challenging terrain, American artillery dominated. Time-on-target missions could saturate areas of forest where German forces concentrated, destroying troops and equipment that individual fire missions might have missed. The simultaneity of impact meant that German soldiers in the forest had no warning. One moment the forest was quiet, the next it erupted in coordinated explosions across hundreds of meters. Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann,
A German artillery forward observer captured in the Hürtgen forest provided a revealing interview to American intelligence. "We thought the forest would protect us from American artillery. The trees made observation difficult. The terrain made coordination hard. But the Americans didn't need to see us precisely. They would strike entire grid squares simultaneously. Our positions, our approach routes, our supply lines, all hit at once. We lost more men to American artillery in the Hürtgen forest than in any previous battle, despite the terrain supposedly favoring defense." The mathematical reality of artillery warfare had shifted decisively in America's favor. A single German artillery battalion operating with traditional methods might destroy one American target per hour if uninterrupted. An American artillery division, using time-on-target coordination, could engage dozens of targets per hour, with each engagement involving multiple battalions firing simultaneously. The force multiplication was extraordinary, not because American guns were superior, they weren't, but because American coordination allowed them to concentrate firepower with a speed and precision German doctrine couldn't match. By late 1944, German artillery batteries were operating under impossible constraints. They couldn't concentrate without being destroyed by time-on-target missions. They couldn't fire aggressively without revealing their positions and inviting devastating counter-battery fire. They couldn't coordinate effectively because their communication systems and doctrine didn't support the flexibility American methods demanded. German artillery, once the most feared in the world, had been systematically neutralized by an innovation they had initially dismissed as impossible. The human toll of this artillery revolution is difficult to quantify precisely, but German casualty reports from late 1944 showed that artillery fire caused an increasing percentage of casualties even as the overall volume of fire remained relatively constant. This paradox, more casualties from equal or less artillery, reflected the devastating effectiveness of time-on-target methods. Simultaneous impacts gave soldiers no opportunity to seek cover, maximizing casualties per shell fired. The psychological impact on German forces was equally significant. German soldiers who had faced Soviet artillery bombardments, British heavy bombers, and American armor attacks consistently reported that American time-on-target missions were among their most feared experiences. The unpredictability, the lack of warning, and the sheer violence of simultaneous impacts created a level of stress that sustained bombardments didn't match. "You could sometimes predict traditional artillery," one German veteran explained years after the war. "Forward observers would spot you, a few ranging shots would follow, then sustained fire. If you were alert, you could sometimes displace before the main bombardment. American time on target gave no such opportunity. One instant you were operational, the next you were destroyed. There was no time to react, no warning to heed. It made every moment feel potentially fatal." The institutional failure of German artillery to adapt to American methods reflected deeper problems in German military culture. The German military system excelled at executing established doctrine and perfecting existing methods. It struggled with fundamental innovation, especially innovation that came from outside traditional military thinking. Time-on-target artillery was exactly this kind of innovation, developed by a mathematics professor turned artillery officer, refined through systematic testing rather than combat experience, and implemented through systematic training rather than traditional military apprenticeship. German military professionals couldn't conceive that a civilian turned officer with limited combat experience could revolutionize artillery warfare. Their system was built on the assumption that military expertise came from years of professional service and combat experience. The notion that systematic analysis and innovative thinking could trump traditional expertise violated their fundamental assumptions about military excellence. This intellectual rigidity proved fatal. While German artillery officers continued refining traditional methods and seeking incremental improvements, American artillery had leaped to a fundamentally different operational paradigm. By the time German leadership recognized the scale of the problem, it was too late to implement the organizational, doctrinal, and training changes that effective countermeasures would have required. Intelligence reports reaching Oberkommando des Heeres in late 1944 painted a grim picture. American artillery was achieving rates of fire, accuracy of targeting, and speed of response that exceeded German capabilities by factors, not percentages. American counter-battery fire was destroying German guns faster than German industry could replace them. American artillery casualties were a fraction of German artillery losses despite comparable numbers of guns engaged. General der Artillerie Walter Lucht, responsible for coordinating German artillery operations on the Western Front, submitted a brutally honest assessment in November 1944. "We face an enemy whose artillery doctrine and capabilities exceed our own in fundamental ways. Their coordination allows them to mass fires from dozens of batteries in minutes. Their communication systems allow them to engage targets across entire sectors simultaneously. Their training produces competent operators in months, where our system requires years. We have lost artillery superiority, and I see no method to regain it with available resources and doctrine." The assessment was filed and largely ignored by higher command. But frontline German artillery commanders knew its truth. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't match, using methods they couldn't counter, with resources they couldn't replace. The American artillery revolution had created a capability gap that no amount of German tactical skill or operational excellence could bridge. As 1944 turned to 1945, and German forces prepared for the final defense of Germany itself, German artillery faced the grimmest situation of the entire war. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered by an enemy whose artillery capabilities had seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. The mockery that German officers had expressed in 1943 had turned to desperate respect by 1945. Respect mixed with the bitter knowledge that they faced an opponent whose innovation they had underestimated until far too late.
The final devastating demonstration of American time-on-target artillery came not from a single dramatic battle, but from a series of operations in early 1945 that showcased the mature evolution of the technique. By this point, time on target wasn't just a tactical method, it was the foundation of American artillery doctrine, executed with such systematic efficiency that it resembled industrial production more than traditional warfare. Operation Grenade, launched in February 1945 as part of the Allied advance to the Rhine River, featured the most sophisticated artillery coordination of the entire war. The operation called for American forces to cross the Ruhr River and advance through prepared German defensive positions. German forces, dug into fortified positions with months to prepare, should have been able to exact a terrible toll on attacking American forces. The American artillery plan for Operation Grenade was extraordinary in its scope and complexity. Over 1,000 artillery pieces, from 105mm howitzers to 240mm atomic cannons, were coordinated to support the assault. The fire plan called for dozens of simultaneous time-on-target missions across a front of approximately 20 kilometers, with missions striking German artillery positions, infantry concentrations, command posts, and communication nodes, all at precisely coordinated moments. On the morning of February 23, 1945, at 02:45 hours, the barrage began. The first mission involved 324 guns from 27 battalions firing simultaneously at German artillery positions. Within a 2-second window, over 3,000 shells struck German battery positions across the entire sector. Before German survivors could even report the strike, a second massive mission hit German forward positions. 30 seconds later, a third mission struck German headquarters locations. The coordination required to execute this barrage exceeded anything previously attempted in warfare. Fire direction centers at corps, division, and battalion level worked in seamless concert, calculating firing times for hundreds of guns, transmitting orders to dozens of batteries, and synchronizing the timing to achieve impacts within seconds of each other across a 20-kilometer front. A German major, commanding an artillery regiment in the sector, survived the barrage and was captured hours later. His description of the experience provides a window into the psychological impact of mature time-on-target doctrine. "We knew an attack was coming.
We had prepared positions, dispersed our batteries, established observation posts. We felt as ready as possible given our limited resources. Then, in a single instant, our entire defensive system was shattered. Not gradually, not sequentially, simultaneously. Our artillery batteries, our forward positions, our headquarters, all struck at once. Within 60 seconds, our regiment ceased to be as a functioning unit. We had no communication with higher command, no artillery support, no coordinated defense. I don't know how many batteries the Americans used, but the effect was like being struck by an avalanche. The tactical result of Operation Grenade validated every principle of time-on-target doctrine. American forces crossed the Ruhr River with minimal casualties, advanced through German defensive positions that should have taken weeks to reduce in days, and achieved their objectives with a speed that shocked both American and German commanders. The contrast with earlier American operations was stark. In 1943, American forces attacking prepared German positions in Italy might advance a few hundred meters per day while suffering heavy casualties. In 1945, using mature time-on-target methods, American forces advanced kilometers per day while suffering a fraction of previous casualty rates. The difference wasn't better infantry, more tanks, or greater air support. It was artillery that could systematically destroy defensive positions before infantry ever engaged them. By March 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany itself, German artillery had effectively ceased to be a major factor in Wehrmacht defensive planning. Individual German batteries continued to operate and inflict casualties, but organized German artillery resistance, the coordinated, sustained counter-battery fire that had been the terror of Allied forces in 1943, had been systematically destroyed. The final statistics told the story of this artillery revolution. In the last 3 months of the European War, American artillery fired approximately 15 million rounds of ammunition. German artillery, with initially comparable numbers of guns, fired less than 3 million rounds, a ratio that reflected not ammunition shortages, but the systematic destruction of German artillery capabilities through time-on-target counter-battery fire. American artillery casualties in early 1945 were remarkably low considering the intensity of combat. Aggressive use of time-on-target methods, fire and displace before counter-battery fire could arrive, provided better protection than any amount of fortification or camouflage. German artillery units, by contrast, suffered catastrophic losses. Entire battalions destroyed by a single time-on-target mission. Battery positions obliterated before firing a single shell in response. The sound of American artillery, the distinctive reports of dozens of guns firing in rapid sequence from scattered positions, became a psychological weapon in itself. German soldiers learned to recognize the pattern. Scattered firing sounds, followed seconds later by devastating simultaneous impact. Veterans claimed they could predict a time-on-target mission seconds before impact just by hearing the firing pattern, though such foreknowledge offered little practical advantage given the speed of the shell's flight. General William Hood Simpson, commanding the Ninth Army in the final drive into Germany, summarized the artillery revolution in a message to his artillery commanders. "You have provided fire support of unprecedented effectiveness. Enemy forces that should have required weeks to reduce have been shattered in hours. German artillery that should have inflicted heavy casualties has been neutralized before engaging our forces. You have transformed artillery from a supporting arm into a decisive weapon of warfare." Back at Fort Sill, now Brigadier General Sands reviewed after-action reports from the final months of the European War with satisfaction, mixed with amazement. The technique he had developed through painstaking experimentation had been refined and expanded beyond anything he had originally imagined. Time-on-target missions involving dozens of battalions, coordinated across entire corps sectors, executed with precision that seemed impossible just 4 years earlier. This was the mature form of the concept he had sketched in 1941.
"I thought I was developing a more efficient firing method," Sands reflected in an interview shortly after the German surrender. What I actually created was a new foundation for artillery warfare, one that emphasized systematic coordination over individual skill, speed over sustained fire, and organizational effectiveness over traditional mastery. The young officers and soldiers who perfected these methods in combat achieved things I never imagined when I began this work. The revolution in artillery warfare that time on target represented had profound implications beyond the immediate tactical battlefield. It demonstrated that systematic innovation could overcome traditional military expertise, that civilian-led thinking could revolutionize military practice, and that American organizational and industrial capabilities could create decisive advantages even against more experienced opponents. The German generals who had laughed at American artillery methods in 1943 had long since stopped laughing. Many didn't survive to see the war's end, killed by the very artillery methods they had dismissed as impossible. Those who survived carried with them the bitter knowledge that their military tradition, refined over centuries and validated in multiple wars, had been rendered obsolete by an innovation they had refused to take seriously until it was far too late. The broader lesson transcended artillery. Time on target demonstrated that in warfare, as in other human endeavors, fresh thinking, unburdened by tradition, can sometimes achieve what centuries of expertise cannot. The Americans hadn't beaten German artillery by being more German than the Germans. They had won by being more American, bringing systematic efficiency, organizational flexibility, and innovative thinking to a domain that Europeans had dominated for centuries. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered and the guns finally fell silent, American artillery had fired its last time-on-target mission. The technique that German generals had mocked in 1943 had become the standard by which all artillery was measured in 1945, and the sound of simultaneous impacts, the signature of time-on-target fire, had become the sound of American artillery dominance, a sound that would echo through military doctrine for generations to come. The impossible had become routine, the mocked had become feared, and the innovation that began with a mathematics professor working late into the night at Fort Sill had transformed into one of the decisive tactical advantages of the Second World War. Sometimes revolutions arrive not gradually, but in a single, devastating instant. And the time-on-target revolution had arrived precisely on time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.